Hi, my name is Aaron Gerds. I'm Associate Professor of Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Taussig Cancer Institute and the Case Comprehensive Cancer Center. It's my pleasure today to speak to you about luspatercept in treating anemia in myelofibrosis. Anemia myelofibrosis is a really prevalent problem. Roughly 40% of patients at the time of diagnosis will have anemia. And over the first year, roughly 60% of patients will develop anemia. And virtually at every patient at some point in time during their disease course will have anemia. So anemia is really common. Anemia is also prognostic. We know that anemia is associated with a worse outcome in patients with myelofibrosis. In fact, patients who have transfusion dependence have much worse in survival than those who are transfusion independent. So there is a dose response curve. The worse the anemia, the worse their survival is. So, and then lastly, anemia is burdensome, right? So being anemic, you feel tired, you can feel run down, you have decreased exercise tolerance, and it's also a burden in the clinic. So getting to the clinic to get your type and screen, getting the transfusion itself, it's a burden on our blood banks, and blood is a very limited resource. So avoiding transfusions is important, as well as treating anemia. Quite Heaven in that whole story made a full circle of where we improve upon anemia and we clearly improve survival, although there are some data out there suggesting that. So that's where luspatercept comes in. So luspatercept is an activin ligand trap that is already FDA approved to treat myelodysplastic syndromes and beta thalassemia. It's been tested in myelofibrosis in the ACE-001 trial, which was a phase 2 study of patients with myelofibrosis who had anemia. And the trial was broken down into 4 major cohorts: patients who were on ruxolitinib but transfusion independent, those on ruxolitinib, or those on and off ruxolitinib, and those who are transfusion dependent and independent. So you can kind of make in your mind it was like a 4x4 table. And overall, the trial really looked to quantify the benefit of adding luspatercept onto either observation or onto ruxolitinib and see, can we improve anemia in these patients? In each of the arms, patients were enrolled and treated with luspatercept, very similar to the label indication, the label prescribing information for luspatercept in the treatment of myelodysplastic syndromes. So all the cohorts had anemia improvement. So patients who were not transfusion had improvements in their hemoglobin, and patients who were transfusion dependent became transfusion independent. The cohort that fared with the best and had the largest number of responses was the cohort of patients, the cohort 3B. So patients who were on ruxolitinib who were transfusion dependent. In that, we saw roughly 30% of patients become transfusion independent for at least a 12-week period during the evaluation period. So a large number of patients had transfusion independence on luspatercept. Additionally, we saw about half the patients have their need for transfusions cut in half. So their transfusion burden, if you will, cut in half. So some really significant improvement in transfusion dependency and transfusion burden. Likewise, we did see patients who were just anemic but not transfusion dependent have improvements in their hemoglobin. In terms of safety and side effects, the most common side effects we saw were hypertension, diarrhea, headaches, and bone pain. So a side effect profile that's very similar to the data in MDS and beta thalassemia. But overall, patients did well. There did not appear to be any additive toxicity when combining luspatercept with ruxolitinib. So this trial was incredibly important because it served as the basis for the ongoing independent study, which is a randomized phase 3 trial looking at luspatercept in combination with ruxolitinib in patients who are transfusion dependent. We will hopefully have the results from that study in early 2025. That study could serve someday as the basis for a label expansion for luspatercept for patients with myelofibrosis. In advance of that potential label expansion, the luspatercept has already been incorporated into guidelines, such as the NCCN guidelines, when focusing on the treatment of anemia in myelofibrosis. Looking forward, we're trying to combine luspatercept with other agents to try to improve anemia responses. So if we look at drugs that inhibit ACVR1, ACVR1 inhibits the SMAD pathway, and activin ligand traps like luspatercept actually inhibit a parallel part of the SMAD pathway. So you'd really be hitting that same pathway in 2 different ways. Also, ACVR1 inhibition alleviates the anemia inflammatory block, making iron available for erythropoiesis. Luspatercept works on late differentiation of red cells, so after iron is incorporated in red cells, so it makes sense. You can use an ACVR1 inhibitor to liberate iron and then push that erythropoiesis with the luspatercept. So trials combining ACVR1 inhibition with drugs like momelotinib or pacritinib in combination with luspatercept are being developed and will be launching shortly. So the next kind of phase of how luspatercept will be developed in myelofibrosis. So it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. We look forward to further developments with this agent for patients who have myelofibrosis and anemia.